I am so sick of animated masterpieces being set on fire and run over by a truck simply because Hollywood refuses to acknowledge animation as live action's equal. This film should not exist. However, the original How to Train Your Dragon is an unimaginably phenomenal story of companionship, history, and acknowledgement of flaws, as well as an excellent exploration of accepting one's own identity and those of others. It holds a placement on IMDb's top 100 films, and it's universally acknowledged as one of the greatest animated films of all time. It's all but flawless. So when I saw one of my favourite franchises would be making the move to live action, I was utterly dismayed. The animated How to Train Your Dragon was perfect. There's nothing that a live action adaptation could even add. But there were promising early signs. Dean DeBlois, the writer and director of the classic trilogy, was directing this remake. Gerard Butler would be reprising his role as Stoic the Vast, and Mason Thames was clearly an incredible casting as Hiccup. I had some other issues with the cast, but I'll dive into them later. When they released the first look at the film, everyone was elated to see that the visuals were incredible, the CGI was excellent, and the set and costume design felt ripped straight from the classic films. There was one word on my mind leading up to the film's release: faithful. Would it be faithful to the original? I was hopeful with DeBlois at the helm, but skepticism was only natural given the history of live action remakes. But the more we saw, the more it looked likely that this movie would be close to a shot-for-shot remake of the original. All we could do was wait and see. Of course I watched it on the day of release. I sat down in cinemas, dredged through what felt like the longest set of adverts I've ever seen, and finally the film begun, and I got immediate chills from that first note of music. I don't know if I watched the original in cinemas, I would have been 4 at the time, but I watched the sequel on the big screen 3 times, more than I have any other film. And though I've seen the first How to Train Your Dragon countless times, there's something so unbelievably special about hearing John Powell's phenomenal score in the cinema. It ensured I couldn't wipe the grin from my face throughout the entire feature. The film opens with that iconic shot devised by Deakins all those years ago, the sweeping tilt across the waves to the island of Berk. I was a little concerned the cinematography wouldn't hold up, given Deakins didn't directly work on this adaptation, and while it definitely doesn't work quite as well in live action, so many of those masterful shots are recreated here, resulting in the film retaining its sheer splendour and visual perfection. It didn't take long for the first change of the movie to be made apparent, and it's really the only one they make throughout. Some lines of dialogue are altered. Admittedly, none of these are bad, but why did they feel the need to change Hiccup's introductory speech that defines the opening sequence? The changes to the dialogue never significantly detract from the film, but in the majority of cases they're simply inferior to the original. There's some exceptions, such as the subtle changes to place emphasis on Hiccup wanting to be one of you guys, though that admittedly does come back to bite the film when Stoic's "you're not a Viking" line is changed to "you're not one of us" in one of the movie's best scenes. But I won't make out like these tweaks are a major gripe. They don't affect the film's overall quality. It's just frustrating to see the dialogue be made inferior to that of the original. As I said, the film doesn't make many changes. It's the shot-for-shot remake it was marketed as, which is exactly what it should have been. Sure, it adds more weight to the fact that this adaptation has no reason to exist, but would we really have wanted them to try to improve a film so perfect as the classic How to Train Your Dragon? They surely would have failed, badly. But the one change it does make is adding a couple of scenes, very minor and all perfectly in line with the original movie. But that classic animated masterpiece had such an efficiently told story, it was such a tight narrative. The scene where Stoic addresses the Vikings prior to their first expedition just felt like unnecessary padding to me. It bulks out the original scene, but not in a way that feels like it adds to the plot or themes. Not a major complaint, since it's still a very good sequence, just an unnecessary one. The other one to note was the extension of the Book of Dragons scene. This change is very interesting to me, since it gives us an entirely new perspective on Hiccup and Astrid's relationship. In the source material, she's very cold and hostile to Hiccup in the beginning of the film. She looks down upon him and considers him a pathetic joke. This later shifts to curiosity and fascination, masked with frustration as he begins to excel in dragon training. However here, it's clear in their earlier interactions that Astrid doesn't harbour this hostility towards him. She still looks down on him, sees him as weak, but it's not in a cruel way. It's like she almost feels sorry for him, which is just not the case in the original. The changes to the Book of Dragons scene put this front and centre, giving them a moment to have a true conversation. In the 2010 animation, Astrid doesn't engage with Hiccup any more than a few scoffs or angry insults. She's presented as hardly acknowledging him, but in the live action, it's clear they do have an established relationship. Not a positive one, but they are peers who are obviously familiar with each other, and Astrid at at least respects him enough to have a full conversation. It gave me the impression that that fascination and curiosity exists at the start of the movie, rather than materializing only when Hiccup begins to outperform her in training. So it changes their dynamic a little, but honestly, I'm a fan of it. To me, it makes their relationship feel more genuine. Astrid was drawn to him before he took her spot as top student. It sows a little more of a spark between them off the bat, and I felt the relationship was stronger for it moving into the later half of the film. This is only accentuated by the radiant chemistry of Mason Thames and Nico Parker. But alright, let's talk about Nico Parker being cast as Astrid. I disapproved, strongly. Not because of her race. I didn't buy into the argument of there were no black Vikings. It's a fantasy film. Dragons didn't exist either. The original movie never once established that the Vikings were the exact same culture as in history. In fact, it rather goes against this in many ways. Du Bois can do what he wants. My issue is that Parker just doesn't look like Astrid. I believe films have a duty to remain faithful to the source material when adapting their content. This is an excellent character who many people are attached to, and they naturally want to see them well represented in live action. If they've given Parker a blonde wig, I frankly never would have complained. But we're all familiar with Du Bois' statement that she is Astrid brought to life, and now that we've got the film in its entirety, yeah, none of us are smart enough to argue with anything that man says, because goddamn was he right. Don't get me wrong, I think a blonde wig still would have gone a long way, but Parker's performance was phenomenal and she filled into the role of Astrid exceptionally, while bringing her own subtle flair to the role. Going forward, I'm shocked to say that I can actually see Nico Parker becoming the true live-action Astrid. And not only is she great in isolation, her aforementioned chemistry with Mason Thames' Hiccup really leapt out of the screen and brought their characters and their emotions to life. That settles it. I like black people now. That was a joke, YouTube, it's just a joke. So I've spoken on the flaws of the film, though calling them flaws may not entirely be fair. They're changes from the original that I find for the most part unnecessary. But let's touch on everything great about this film. For the most part, it's the same praises I have for that classic movie. Absolutely stellar cinematography, excellent editing, probably my favourite soundtrack of any movie, great acting, and I must now add appraisal for the set and costume design, as well as the designs of the dragons. They all look great, though they're definitely more intense than the cuter aesthetics of the original. The Red Death in particular is honestly harrowing. The scale of this beast becomes much more intimidating than it was in animation. One touch they made which I absolutely adored was the references to newer additions to the franchise. Hearing them reference the Skrill, one of the most awesome dragons from the animated shows, was such an incredible moment, and the first where I saw evidence of some improvements to the original movie. There's references throughout to Hiccup's mother, a character introduced in the second movie, and I think revealing to the audience that she was taken by dragons does add depth to Hiccup's dilemma, especially given new viewers would assumed she was just aligned with Stoic and the other Vikings' hatred of dragons, unaware that she was much closer to Hiccup's ideology. But the best of these references comes in the relationship of Snotlout and Spitelout. Spitelout did appear in the original, but he was a nameless background character. It was only the shows that elaborated on him and his relationship with Snotlout, and it's often some of the best character writing in those stories. They really were great. This movie made the bold decision to actually feature this dynamic in some passing moments and created an emotionally resonant minor plot wholly unique to this adaptation. I'm truly excited to see how this plays into the already confirmed 2027 sequel, since I've got a hunch we might see the roles of the supporting cast move away from the love triangle and into something new, potentially revolving around Snotlout and Spitelout. But it's a truly excellent addition that's incorporated in a way that doesn't detract from the efficient pacing of the story. It's simply quick moments, single lines that make Snotlout a far better character than he was in 2010. I want to mention briefly the scene where Stoic and the other Vikings return from their failed expedition. There's an incredibly minor change here, only noticeable when you've seen the original as many times as I have. When they get off the boats, Stoic simply walks away. In the animated film, he stops after departing to help one of his fellow Vikings off the boat. It was such a powerful moment that spoke to the quality of Stoic's leadership and subtly made the audience like him more, which enhanced the complexity of his dynamic with Hiccup. I just don't see why it was removed here. You can see how much I'm nitpicking with these flaws, but that's simply because this adaptation really doesn't do much wrong. It's for the most part a shot-for-shot remake of the perfect animated classic, with the changes it does make being only slightly weaker than the original, and some actually enhancing it. I can honestly see some people preferring this version to the original. I definitely don't think that way. I think many of this film's visual motifs and significant moments work better in animation, but I can at least see why some may think that way. Do you understand how unfathomably impressive that is. A live action adaptation, which are historically awful, actually holds up to the original animated film, in some areas improving upon it, and ultimately making a movie that's only inferior to the source material by an incredibly slim margin. Sure, if a live action B-movie did that, it wouldn't be anything special, but for How to Train Your Dragon, a film which many consider the greatest animated movie of all time, a film which takes a silver medal as my second favourite movie I've ever seen, that's a monumental achievement, and this is a moment that needs to be cemented in the history of cinema. How it will affect the future of the art, particularly adaptations of animated material, I couldn't say. I'm definitely worried. Studios will no doubt be encouraged by this film's success, and we'll have another slew of terrible live action remakes to follow. But I'm holding out hope that How to Train Your Dragon can serve as a shining example of what a live action adaptation can and should be, and can pave the way for more excellent remakes in the future. Since there's no avoiding it now, we're going to get more of them. I was so frustrated by the announcement of this film, scared that one of my favourite franchises would be completely dragged through the mud by corporate greed. But How to Train Your Dragon once again proves how incredible this story and the people responsible for it truly are, and I'm so unbelievably thankful that I got to witness one of my favourite films of all time adapted to the silver screen in a fresh coat of paint and sit there with nothing but joy for the entire 2 hours. I understand and agree that it shouldn't have been made, but an entire new generation of people are going to witness this phenomenal story thanks to this adaptation, and I truly think it holds up to the original, an original that stands head and shoulders above the majority of films as the pinnacle of animation. How to Train Your Dragon is the first great live action adaptation, and is undeniably deserving of a perfect 10 out of 10. I only pray the sequel can be just as excellent.